80% of the world's agricultural trade crosses an ocean before it reaches your plate. Roughly 1.9 million seafarers keep that system moving every day. Those crews are now trapped between missile risk, lockdown legacies, and legal rules that were not built for this level of disruption. The immediate threat is not only drought or crop failure, but the loss of safe labor mobility for the people who move food. This crisis now shapes prices from farm gate to grocery shelf. It also compounds in ways that standard inflation models miss. Maritime shipping carries more than 80% of global merchandise by volume, and grain dependency is even deeper than that average. When this network slows, food access and affordability both deteriorate. Two forces are driving the breakdown, and they reinforce each other. The first is a labor shortage that industry forecasts place above 90,000 licensed officers by 2026. The second is escalating violence around critical choke points. Together, they create a system where ships cannot move safely or legally at scale. Labor shortfalls are not only a staffing inconvenience. SOLAS rules require each vessel to meet a minimum safe manning document before sailing. If required officers are missing, the ship cannot legally depart. On land, dock worker and crane operator shortages produce the same bottleneck in terminals. Geopolitical risk amplifies that bottleneck. The South China Sea alone carries an estimated $5.3 trillion in annual commerce. That is roughly 24% of global maritime trade. The Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Strait of Hormuz carry much of the remainder. When any one corridor is threatened, disruption spreads quickly across unrelated supply chains. Vessels reroute, schedules slip, and equipment pools fragment. Port queues then lengthen, and rotations lose synchronization. Researchers describe this as a multidimensional disruption matrix, with sea, port, and route effects compounding simultaneously. Schedule reliability data shows how far the system fell. During the pandemic-era shock, on-time vessel performance dropped to 32%. Recovery later stabilized near 65.3%. That still means roughly 1 in 3 shipments arrives late. Carrier performance also diverged sharply. Gemini cooperation reached 89.9% schedule reliability, while MSC reached 79%. Ocean Alliance operated near 66.9%. Premier Alliance fell to just 55.4%. For shippers tied to lower reliability services, delay risk is structural. Missed windows propagate into storage, spoilage, and procurement penalties. Agricultural exporters cannot simply reroute perishables without cost. Reliability dispersion therefore becomes price dispersion in food markets. This reliability gap also rewrites bargaining power across contracts. Large buyers with stronger leverage can secure preferred slots and absorb uncertainty with deeper balance sheets. Smaller exporters and vulnerable importers do not get that cushion, so delay risk is priced directly into their margins. What looks like a logistics metric becomes a distributional shock across the food economy. The origin of this compound disruption traces to COVID-19 border controls. Between March and August of 2020, only 25% of normal crew changes were completed. Mobility restrictions broke the labor rotation cycle that global shipping depends on. The system kept moving cargo while exhausting the people running it. At peak disruption, about 400,000 seafarers were stranded at sea, many working on expired contracts beyond the Maritime Labor Convention maximum of 11 months. Another 400,000 were stranded ashore and unable to join vessels. The labor pool was split in two, and both halves were constrained. The contradiction was severe. Governments demanded uninterrupted deliveries of food, energy, and medicine. The same governments often blocked disembarkation, transit, or emergency medical access for crews. Crew changes became humanitarian and operational emergencies at once. Shipping continued, but under accumulated fatigue risk. That contradiction had long-tail effects beyond the pandemic window itself. Maritime workers saw essential service rhetoric coexist with fragmented legal protection, and trust in institutional support weakened. Once trust erodes, retention falls, and new entrants hesitate, even when wage signals improve. The pipeline then remains brittle after border controls are lifted. Where rotations were possible, vessels diverted to a small set of designated ports. That pushed direct crew change cost to about $4,000 per seafarer. Dry bulk operators then faced elevated fatigue exposure from delayed relief. Some vessels slowed, and others suspended activity. Financial pressure followed quickly. Capesize daily operating costs rose about 10%. Crew expense reached $3,144 per day in that period. Time charter rates climbed to decade highs. Fleet economics shifted from tight to unstable. Asset valuations reflected the same stress. A 5-year-old Panamax vessel rose from $22 million to $82 million within a year. That tripling was driven by scarcity of operable tonnage. Grain logistics became a capital intensity shock, as well as a routing shock. Food transport costs then inherited both pressures. By late 2023, the crisis entered a new phase. Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb added direct kinetic risk. Operators now had to price missile exposure, drone threats, and GPS spoofing. Regulatory delay had become battlefield risk. That difference changed decision logic. A regulatory delay can sometimes be negotiated or absorbed. A kinetic threat creates a binary choice between route abandonment and catastrophic loss. Major carriers diverted around the Cape of Good Hope, added at least 3,000 nautical miles to many voyages. It also added an average of 10 to 14 sailing days on Asia to Europe routes. Red Sea container throughput fell to roughly 35 to 40% of baseline. Time, fuel, and risk moved in the same direction. The network consequences extend far beyond one diverted lane. Late arrivals at one node disrupt berth windows, inland handoffs, and equipment repositioning at downstream nodes. Empty container imbalances then feed back into export bottlenecks, especially for time-sensitive agri-food cargoes. A regional security disrupt therefore behaves like a system-wide scheduling failure. Route penalties were severe, even before secondary congestion effects. Shanghai to Rotterdam via Suez is about 11,000 nautical miles. Via the Cape, that route becomes roughly 14,000 nautical miles. Distance alone forced schedule redesign. Transit time penalties followed distance penalties. The Shanghai to Rotterdam diversion added about 8 to 10 days. Shanghai to Genoa rose from 8,600 nautical miles to 13,500 nautical miles. The Genoa route extension added about 11 to 13 days. Mid-voyage diversion was the worst case. Ships already in the Indian Ocean often had to backtrack and reroute after new threat notices. Some voyages added up to 14 extra days in total delay. Network planning assumptions failed in real time. Round-trip cycle time then expanded across fleets. Many vessels spent an extra 2 to 3 weeks at sea per loop. Effective container capacity was trapped in transit rather than available for reload. Origin equipment shortages spread across major Asian ports. Fleet workload metrics confirmed the distortion. Global ton miles rose by about 6%. Projected trade volume growth for 2025 was only about 0.5%. The system was burning more fuel and tying up more capital to move roughly the same cargo. Insurance pricing became another transmission channel. The London Market's Joint War Committee designation determines where enhanced risk pricing applies. Standard hull cover around 0.25 to 0.35% of cargo value was replaced in war zones. Pre-crisis war risk levels, near 0.15%, were no longer relevant. War risk supplements reached as high as 3% of vessel and cargo value. Across tanker and bulk fleets, that translated into roughly $1.5 to $3 billion in additional annual operating cost. Insurance moved from background overhead to frontline pricing variable. Agricultural freight contracts absorbed that shift. Once insurance reprices at that scale, behavior changes before any shipment is loaded. Charter terms tighten, route acceptance narrows, and contract flexibility declines as underwriters impose stricter exposure conditions. Shippers then pay not only for movement, but also for uncertainty management embedded in every clause. The premium becomes a structural component of delivered food cost. March 2026 marked the peak escalation window. Military confrontation involving the United States, Israel, and Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Maersk, COSCO, and other carriers shifted to long-term Cape routing. The Middle East corridor lost immediate commercial reliability. Per-voyage fuel impact was extreme. Each diverted trip could consume upwards of $1 million in additional fuel. Air freight for time-sensitive goods spiked by 400%. The spike occurred inside a 48-hour window. Agri-food inputs were hit where substitution is hardest. The Persian Gulf supplies roughly 30% of global ammonia exports. It also supplies about 49% of global urea exports. Urea is a core nitrogen input for high-yield agriculture. When escalation intensified in March 2026, Qatar halted production at a major urea facility. Within weeks, landed urea cost in the United States rose by about 35%. Qatar's nitrogen fertilizer exports support food production for nearly 43 million people across the United States, Brazil, and India. A shipping shock became a fertilizer shock, with delayed harvest consequences. Timing made mitigation harder. The Hormuz disruption hit during Northern Hemisphere spring planting. Farmers had to absorb input inflation or reduce application rates. Agencies warned of structural yield risk in the 2027 cycle. Vulnerability was highest across Brazil, India, and the African continent. Fertilizer shocks are especially dangerous because the yield effects are delayed and cumulative. Application decisions are made early, but outcome visibility appears much later in harvest data. By the time losses are measured, corrective action for that cycle is no longer available. What begins as a maritime disruption can persist as multi-season food insecurity. The human toll inside shipping is equally severe. Seafarer depression rates are about 25% higher than general population levels. Maritime suicide rates run about 17% above global averages. Stress illness accounts for roughly 40% of seafarer medical repatriations. Fatigue risk is not abstract. It is linked to an estimated 80% of maritime accidents and equipment failures. Extended contracts and uncertain relief cycles intensify that fatigue. Safety degradation then feeds back into schedule reliability. Human limits become operational limits. Workforce damage also compounds over time, rather than resetting after one incident. A single period of prolonged over-contract service can push experienced officers out of the sector permanently. Replacing that experience requires years of training, certification, and sea time that cannot be compressed quickly. Retention, therefore, becomes a core resilience variable, not a human resources side issue. Abandonment cases show the system's deepest legal fracture. In these cases, owners sever wages, provisions, and repatriation support. Recorded affected seafarers rose to 1,399 in 2021. They rose again to 1,555 across 113 ships in 2022. The pattern worsened in 2023. More than 1,676 seafarers were reported abandoned across 410 vessels. Each case removes labor confidence from an already stressed workforce. Recruitment and retention then deteriorate further. The labor shortage deepens itself. Legal protections in warlike operations areas change decision power in 2026. Seafarers transiting designated war zones receive a 100% wage bonus. Disability or death in those zones requires double compensation. Most importantly, crews hold an absolute right to refuse deployment into designated war areas. Exercising that right carries mandatory obligations for ship owners. A refused deployment requires voyage halt, repatriation at owner cost, and compensation equal to 2 months of basic wage. After Hormuz was designated, these rights became operationally binding. Legal compliance and route planning collided in real time. The Philippines made that shift explicit through Advisory Number 11. Authorities were tracking 7,313 Filipino seafarers on vessels operating in or near the Middle East. Even small refusal fractions can drop a vessel below minimum safe manning. With a global officer shortfall above 90,000, replacement is often not immediately available. Downstream food logistics absorbed all these pressures at once. Carriers canceled scheduled departures through blank sailings. Data showed 56 cancellations out of 675 planned sailings, a baseline reduction of 8.3%. The Alliance posted 31 cancellations out of 142 sailings, equal to 21.8%. For cargo planners, blank sailings create a planning environment that is probabilistic rather than scheduled. Exporters must choose between costly holding, risky dispatch timing, or degraded quality windows for perishables. Importers then increase precautionary inventory where financing allows, which further tightens available transport capacity. The result is a self-reinforcing loop of delay, hedge behavior, and higher landed cost. Perishables face biological penalties that scale with delay. Deterioration can double or triple with each 10 degrees Celsius temperature increase. Congested, understaffed ports raise reefer power interruption risk. Temperature excursions can make entire cargoes unsellable. Bulk commodities absorb mostly economic penalties, but the scale remains severe. Transport costs often represent 20 to 30% of imported product value for least developed and net food importing developing countries. 1 day of vessel delay costs roughly $25,000 to $45,000. These costs pass into import bills quickly. A 10% increase in dry bulk freight rates raises the global food import bill by about 1.2% after 1 year. A 10% container freight shock raises it about 3.5%. More than 70% of that container effect lands in the first 6 months. Shock transmission is front-loaded. Cost concentration is asymmetric along the chain. At farm gate, elevated charter rates widen basis and reduce cash prices paid to producers. At retail, higher logistics costs keep shelf prices elevated. Between those endpoints, 9 major carriers collected $13.9 billion in demurrage and detention over a 41-month pandemic period. Historical comparisons show why this phase is different. The Ever Given grounding in 2021 blocked Suez and delayed an estimated $9.6 billion of trade per day. That event was acute and localized, and system recovery came within weeks. The crew change and war risk crisis is chronic and network-wide. The pandemic phase degraded fleet efficiency for over 2 years without physically blocking a choke point. The Red Sea and Hormuz phase added direct militarization of core corridors. This combination has no close precedent in modern agri-food logistics. A few salvage assets cannot resolve it. The old globalization assumption of low-risk, low-cost ocean transit no longer holds. Supply chains now price permanent geopolitical volatility, war risk insurance spikes, and legally complex labor scarcity. Food logistics must internalize that risk baseline, rather than treat it as a temporary anomaly. Strategic planning windows have shifted from episodic to continuous disruption. That strategic shift requires governance changes as much as operational changes. Public policy, carrier contracting, and labor protections were designed for separated risks, not tightly coupled shocks occurring in sequence. Without coordination across those layers, each actor optimizes locally, while the network destabilizes globally. The system can still function, but only with explicit resilience design rather than baseline assumptions of frictionless flow. The practical implications are immediate. Freight and insurance risk now need permanent inclusion in food pricing models. Critical inputs like nitrogen fertilizer require diversification away from choke point dependency. Maritime labor agreements need redesign that protects seafarer rights while preserving minimum operability. If crews cannot safely get to work, vessels do not move. If vessels do not move, food does not move. If food does not move, price pressure persists across everything on the plate. That is the invisible blockade, shaping the next phase of global food inflation.